Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. Today I will talk about Russo-Japanese War, which was called a small victorious war in Russia. It was very important for Russian political development at the beginning of the 20th century, being one of the factors of future revolution. It also showed that Russian army was backward and underdeveloped. The conflict had its origins in the 1860s when Russia and Japan started to develop. They tried to emulate the more advanced nations of the West. In Russia during the 1860s, serfdom had been abolished, opening the way for the development of an expansionist economy. In Japan in the same decade, the Meiji Restoration had led to the abandonment of Japanese exclusiveness. Instead of shrinking from foreign contact, Japan sought to preserve its independence by imitating the Western powers. It industrialized too, armed and sought spheres of influence abroad. For both Russia and Japan, the obvious region for expansion was the territory of the ever-weakening Chinese Empire. Japan was especially interested in Korea, whose nearest cape was only 100 miles distant. For Russia, meanwhile, Manchuria, Korea, and perhaps Mongolia were the main interest. In 1860, China's weakness had enabled Russia to obtain, by treaty, Chinese territory on the Pacific, which became the maritime province. Here, the naval base of Vladivostok was built, and here the Russian Empire found itself adjacent to Korea. Japan started a war with China in 1894 till 1895, and easily defeated weakened China, signing Shimonoseki Treaty. Japan demanded a free hand in Korea, plus the cession of Formosa, now it's Taiwan, and Liaodong Peninsula. Liaodong Peninsula is a southern extremity of Manchuria, projecting into the Yellow Sea. On it stood Port Arthur, a fortified harbor through which much of Manchurian trade channeled. The Japanese acquisition of Port Arthur would seriously threaten Russian ambitions in Manchuria. Other powers were also anxious about Japan's threat to their influence in China. So Russia, together with Germany and France, put an ultimatum. This intervention was successful and Japan gave up Liaodong Peninsula and left it to China. In 1896, Russian Empire signed a friendship treaty with China. According to this treaty, China allowed Russia to build railway in Manchuria to connect with Vladivostok. Russia sent builders and troops to protect the construction. In order to house the railway workers, Russian settlements were founded across all Manchuria and at Harbin. Harbin was the main railway town. A Russian city was established, which remained a thriving Russian community up to 1949. That friendship virtually made Russia the guarantor of China's territorial integrity, against whom this treaty was directed, was clear. It was Japan. In 1898, Russia forced Peking government to lease the Liaodong Peninsula with Port Arthur, and to concede the right to build a branch of the railway southward from Harbin to Port Arthur. In 1902, Russia was ready to open railway in Manchuria and sent more military troops there. Although Japan was humiliated in 1895 by giving up conquered territories, Tokyo would agree to give a free hand over Manchuria to Russia if it was given Korea. Both countries tried to negotiate sphere of influence but failed. Too many influential Russians and Japanese opposed such a compromise. Even those who wanted peace acknowledged that such a peace could only be temporary. The war seemed inevitable and desirable. In 1902, Japan made an alliance with Great Britain. This was the first alliance which Japan had ever signed with a major power. For the British, the Anglo-Japanese alliance came as a useful stroke against Russia. For British government, the best check to Russian ambitions in the East was a strong Japan. Japan started to modernize the army and navy, buy British machine guns, inviting engineers to rebuild the ships. They created a new chemical substance for bombs called shimose, which created a greater damage for the ships. In response, Nicholas II sent Minister of Defense Kuropatkin to expedite the army in the Far East. In 1903, he returned to St. Petersburg and convinced the Tsar that everything was good. However, in fact, Russian army faced many problems. First, Russian army was scattered all around Far East. There were troops in Vladivostok, Chita, Blagoveshchensk, and Port Arthur. The second problem was remoteness. As Far East is a vast territory, troops were located too far from the logistics centers and did not receive equipment in time. Third, lack of weapons and equipment. For example, Port Arthur had 542 cannons according to official statement, but in fact only 20% could be used. On January 24, 1904, Japanese diplomats stated that Japan broke diplomatic relations with Russia. The war started on January 27th, when Japan attacked Russian squadron. They issued 6 torpedoes and put out 3 Russian ships. At the same time, Japan attacked 2 Russian ships coming out from Korean port Chemulpo. The cruiser Varyak received many damages. Its captain decided to sink cruiser and blew up gunboat Korean. Nicholas II called for partial mobilization, recruiting soldiers from the villages. Petersburg society experienced increasing patriotism. Even the opposition, which always criticized the Tsar and government, supported Russian army and came to agreement to stop revolutionary activities for the war period. The whole war could be divided into 3 big battles: Port Arthur, Mukden, and Tsushima. A legendary Admiral Makarov was sent to Port Arthur. Upon arriving, he expedited the defense level in the fortress. However, he died soon after on one of the raids. His ship was blown up by Japanese mine. His death became a demoralizing factor for all soldiers in Port Arthur. To attack Port Arthur, Japanese army started offensive in Jinzhou in May 1904. This operation was called Battle of Nanshan. Russian army retreated, leaving their road to Port Arthur open. Russians also left the town of Dalan without fight. Dalan was a logistic port for Russian army with food, artillery, and weaponry. The shelling of Port Arthur began on August 7, 1904. Russian army with leading commander Kondratenko were trying to protect fortress and didn't let Japanese occupy it. But with the death of commander, Russian defense wasn't capable to continue fighting. In December, Russians surrendered. The siege of Port Arthur created a great discontent in masses in Russia. The war, which had to be small and victorious, became long and difficult. People came to realize that one of the strongest European armies is losing to a small Asian country. The year of 1905 started with shooting down peaceful demonstration in Petersburg, which would later term the Bloody Sunday. The number of protests, boycotts, and revolutionary activities were rapidly increasing. In February 1905, Japanese army started offensive near Mukden. Kuropatkin gathered all reserves but did not counterattack. When Japanese army made a danger of getting Russian army into a circle, Kuropatkin retreated and gave up Mukden. Nicholas II decided to send to Pacific Battle Baltic Squadron. The squadron traveled several months going all along Africa. When Baltic Squadron arrived, Mukden and Port Arthur were surrendered, but Nicholas II ordered to fight. Squadron entered Tsushima Strait. The captain tried to rearrange formation of ships in order to prepare for the battle, but Japanese ships started to attack. 11 Russian ships were destroyed, 6 were captured. The war was lost. It was a time to negotiate. Russia lost its Far East army, navy. The revolution was spreading. Japan had also big casualties in terms of soldiers and ships. Its small economy could not bear another year of war. 2 sides met in Portsmouth. Japan demanded, first, free hand on Korea and Manchuria. Second, Sakhalin Island, which belonged to Russia. Third was contribution. Next, economic and transportation resources of Far East, Manchurian Railway returning all captured Japanese ships. Fifth, limitation on Russian Army and Navy in Far East. And the last one, the right of fishery trading along Russian coast. Russia agreed on most of the conditions and signed a treaty in September 1905. It gave up Manchuria with Port Arthur and railway. Russia gave half of Sakhalin Island, the southern part. So why Russia lost this war? I would outline following reasons. First, remoteness. The battles took place too far from the logistic centers. Army could not be transferred fast. Second, underestimation of enemy. Russian Tsar and government thought that a small Asian country could not be a strong enemy. Third, bad managing of commanding staff. There were too many commanders in charge who did not coordinate actions with each other. Fourth, demotivated army. Many soldiers could not understand why they had to die so far away from their home in the name of hated Tsar. And the last one, revolution. Russian government was more occupied with the domestic situation and how to save Tsardom than making a war strategy in 1905. That's how a
Thank you
small
for watching
victorious
my
war
videos. Please
ended.
subscribe to my
Thank you for
channel
watching
and
my
I'll see you
videos.
next
Please
time. Bye
subscribe to
bye.
my channel and I'll
Thank
see
you
you
for
next
watching
time.
my
Bye
videos.
bye.
Please subscribe.